If you boycott against Israel, New York will boycott you. If you divert revenues from Israel, New York will divert revenues from you. If you sanction Israel, New York will sanction you. Period.
In a violation of free speech rights, boycotting Israel could become illegal in the U.S. Proposed legislation in Congress would make it a crime for Americans to boycott Israel, even though that is their constitutionally protected right. For years, Congress has tried to pass laws that would criminalize a boycott of Israel, a top priority for the pro-Israel lobby and major donors to both Democrats and Republicans. These laws would make it illegal for Americans to refuse on political grounds to do business with Israel. They portray the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, or BDS, as a form of anti-Semitism.
There's only one word for it: anti-Semitism. Let us call out the BDS movement for what it is.
BDS is a movement calling on supporters to withhold business and cultural interactions with Israel as a non-violent form of pressure to demand Palestinian rights. In early 2019, the previously introduced Combating BDS Act failed to advance in Congress. This bill would have given state and local governments the power to boycott any businesses that boycott Israel. It's also being pushed forward by the pro-Israel lobby and would work to legally strengthen already existing anti-BDS laws at the state level. This comes after Congress failed to pass the Israel Anti-Boycott Act as part of a spending bill before the end of its term in 2018. Faz Shakir of the American Civil Liberties Union says the proposed legislation violates Americans' constitutionally protected freedom of speech. He believes many members of Congress are unaware of the constitutional implications of this legislation. The Israel Anti-Boycott Act proposes prohibiting boycotts against allies of the United States, specifically calling out boycotts against Israel. Church groups like Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, and others have announced divestment from Israel. Israel's supporters are seeking to shut down the movement as support grows for citizen action like BDS. Today, 26 states have passed anti-BDS laws, with 13 additional states considering similar measures as well. But in two separate court cases, federal judges in Kansas and Arizona ruled that state laws punishing individuals or companies for partaking in BDS were unconstitutional and violated free speech rights. Meanwhile, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would force the U.S. Department of Education to treat criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic harassment. In other words, a violation of the Civil Rights Act. This would effectively stifle the speech of Palestinian rights advocacy groups and ironically would use anti-Semitism as grounds to silence even Jewish critics of Israel, like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. The First Amendment prevents Congress from making laws that limit free speech. And the ACLU has publicly criticized these pieces of legislation for undermining constitutional values. So what happens if these pieces of legislation are passed and become law? Let's start with the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. This law is actually an amendment of the 1979 Export Administration Act, which prohibited U.S. citizens and companies from boycotting friendly nations. U.S. citizens would also be unable to request any information about companies that conduct business relations with Israel, and wouldn't even be allowed to notify the UN if it's unknowingly doing business with Israel. Under this proposed law, both individuals and companies could face financial penalties for supporting EU or UN-backed boycotts of Israel, Israeli companies, and specifically those in the occupied West Bank. Violations of the law could see U.S. citizens paying up to $250,000 in civil penalties. Willful violations of the law could see citizens fined up to $1 million. And then there's the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which the ACLU and other activist organizations have issued statements opposing. This bill would work to silence critics and criticism of Israel in schools, colleges, and universities. And institutions of learning would also work to ensure that their campuses are spaces where criticism of Israel cannot occur, violating their free speech rights to avoid investigations by the Department of Education. This could result in numerous lawsuits and court cases in which activists and educational institutions sue the government for violations of their free speech and civil rights.